Hey, welcome back, everybody. Okay, this is part two. By the way, I hope you enjoy a little Primus, just to add a little music to the video lectures. So, we went through, in the first part, the beginnings of the chapter introduction, the part where we talked about republicanism and the internal politics of the Whig Party, and how they sought to minimize the power of the king, the arbitrary authority of the king. We talked about mercantilism and the problems with colonial grievances, the eventual benefits of mercantilism for the colonies, the imposition of the Stamp Act, and ultimately we were going to get into here the problem with the repeal of the Stamp Act. So let's get right into this. Okay, sorry if I'm hurting your eyes here. So we were at the point where we were talking about virtual representation as well as non-importation and the impact that played on influencing Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. But there are a couple things that I wanted to point out here. We did talk about petitions, boycotts, and assemblies. You know, while this wasn't important in influencing Parliament's mind, it was important in mobilizing the beginnings of a movement. So, you know, nowadays we kind of think of protest movements as nothing big. I mean, the Arab Spring was this enormous movement of people to stand up for democratic participation in their own government. We are familiar in our folklore and our recent history with the movement of the civil rights groups to demand equal representation and freedom from segregation in American society. We see that there are union movements and protests against that all the time, environmental movements, and so on. But you know, all of these movements, whether we consider them revolutionary or just kind of like protest movements, they all begin to get their start from this early pre-revolutionary period. So, you know, the basic point that I'm trying to get across here is that there was no real precedent for, you know, this level of social mobilization. The petitions, the boycotts, the assemblies, the protests, the formation of the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty, the the violence against customs officials, the forcing of Stamp Act officials, stamp agents to resign. All of these things were relatively new during this period. So that's important. Okay. The other thing I wanted to talk about here is the broader context of all of this. Your book goes into it too. I mean, your book points out that America bought 1/4 of all British exports. Well, that's pretty significant. So if Americans, through non-importation, are not buying those exports, then you're seeing the British merchants getting hit pretty hard. Okay? 1/2 of British shipping was devoted to American trade. That is enormous. Okay? There are 7.5 million Britons, and there are 2 million colonists. So your book points out that Parliament couldn't get through their heads was why the 7.5 million Britons should have to pay heavy taxes to support these colonies when the colonists refused to pay 1/3 of the cost of their own defense. Okay? And ultimately, we'll see that Parliament does back down. Part of this is because of internal economic pressure that they're facing, but they do stick it to the colonies a bit by imposing something called the Declaratory Act, which means that they bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. You know, if the colonies thought that, you know, the protests and the Stamp Act Congress and all of these things were going to influence Parliament, well, Parliament's basically saying it doesn't matter anything to us, okay? Because you are our subjects. So, what happens is, you know, the next stage. And by the way, I mean, let's be real here. This next stage and the period from 1765 to 1775, I mean, we're talking 10 years. I mean, you know, it's been 11 years since the attack on 9/11. And 10 years is a pretty significant time. So I just want to build a visualization here that, while it seems like these events are coming like one after the other very quickly, I mean, people are going about their normal lives. And they're fairly happy in their normal lives. You're not talking about, we're not talking about, the unrest in the colonies, and I mean, things are going relatively well. So the British decide to implement some new duties. They are regulations and duties on glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Okay, so Charles Townshend, Chancellor of the Exchequer, begins to take a look here at internal and external taxes. So internal taxes are what the colonists have no problem with because they have elected representatives. External taxes they see as being a problem. Okay, so Townsend decides that these new taxes, oh yeah, the money from it's going to pay for the royal governor's salaries and judges, by the way, who are in charge of enforcing the laws. So this, tactic that the colonists had for refusing to pay the governors, that wasn't going to be an issue anymore. And they also suspended the legislature of New York. This is a separate issue because New York, their colonial assembly, didn't give beds and food for British soldiers. So, what happens in the colonies? Well, there are a couple things. One is we get this one incident. Okay, it's March 5th, 1770. Your book has these images right here. It is known as the Boston Massacre, and even though the British soldiers who had been in Boston since 1768 were there and were harassed by a mob and opened fire on the mob, there was a trial. The trial was the soldiers were defended by John Adams, as I've talked about in class, and we see here that there is, for the first time, real violence. Not just, the tarring and feathering, not just ransacking the homes, not just, issuing threats to people, but actual military violence by the British Army against Americans who are seen completely as innocent here. So I don't really want to go into the point of debating the actual events and the series of events. This is a fascinating story of two different perspectives in American history. The colonial perspective and the British perspective. What is important is the impact of the Boston Massacre, and that impact is felt throughout the colonies. So the newspapers around the colonies begin to carry this message, and it begins to influence people. Okay, one of the other tactics that the colonists use after the Boston Massacre is they set up what is called committees of correspondence and circular letters. Samuel Adams here was one of them, the people who helped organize them. These circular letters were designed to help Parliament repeal the Townshend duties. They were to coordinate efforts across the different colonies. And, these letters refer me back. I start thinking about the Albany Plan that in 1754 Benjamin Franklin had to unite the colonies together. And if you remember, he came up with this cartoon image of a snake being cut up, and the message below it was join or die. Well, the basic premise here is that the colonies are very slowly beginning to work together. Their elected representatives are speaking to one another, and they are beginning to organize themselves into what's called a committee of correspondence. I mean, this is like, people using Twitter today and Facebook, like during the Arab Spring. So just as the Egyptian government took control of all of the telecommunications companies in Egypt to shut down social media, well, the British try and do the same thing, okay? They see this as sedition, treason, okay? And it's something that they want to speak out against. So what happens? Non-importation by 1773 was beginning to weaken. This tea tax is actually not that big of a deal. So some colonists were reluctant to pay it, but most were actually paying it because the legal tea was now cheaper than the smuggled tea. Okay, and it was even cheaper, as your book points out, the tea in England. So the British are beginning to catch on to here, to the tactics being used in the colonies. If the colonies want to make this an economic issue, not an issue of principle, well, it is beginning to work. So what happens is that eventually the British gives the British East India Company a monopoly on the tea. That pushes the colonists to organize boycotts against the tea. They begin to actually stop the ships from landing in Maryland, in Pennsylvania, in Charleston, and in Boston. And Boston even becomes worse because what happens is we get this Tea Party right here that your book talks about, in which on December 16th, 1773, huge amounts of tea were symbolically thrown into Boston Harbor, and this was it. Like, the British were beginning to take, like, some issues. I mean, if you think about it, they repealed the Stamp Act, right? They repealed the Townshend duties. But, the destruction of property and the threat of their soldiers that they were facing by mob violence was beginning to take its toll. And so what they do is they pass something that they call the coercive acts, like they're going to arm twist the colonies back into shape. But the colonists themselves call them the Intolerable Acts. And so, I did want to go over these. Your book points out a few of them, but not really all of them. So what begins to happen here is that the British closed the Boston port. They say that there is no business coming in or out. Now, that's pretty much taking away money. That's like starving the people of Boston. Today we call them economic sanctions, like those being imposed on Iran. But back then, I mean, you have Boston, which is about, 20,000 people. Most of them are relying on trade by the sea for their economic feasibility, their life, blood. So there are a couple other things that happen. The British government also tells the colonists that they can't meet. The legislature is shut down and meetings are banned. The Quebec Act is tagged onto the Intolerable Acts, and even though it's not intended to be a part of punishing the colonists, basically the British government goes along with saying that the French Catholics can have freedom of religion in France. So from the colonial point of view, they're putting like 1+1 here. Like, yes, we have the Intolerable Acts, and we have the Quebec Act. It looks like the British are beginning to set up like an alternative government in British Canada. So what happens is that the Intolerable Acts push the colonists further and further into this idea of open rebellion. Okay? Here we take a look at the colonies, and your book points out we have the proclamation line right here, 1763, and the Quebec issue right over here, threatening New England and the closing of Boston Harbor. So there is bloodshed. Eventually what happens is the Continental Congress meets. They actually organize and try and coordinate their activities. George Washington was there, Patrick Henry, Sam Adams, John Adams, as well as many others. They begin to form what's called the Association. They begin to kind of consolidate all of their colonial grievances together, and they even petition the British government. Okay? So what happens here is that in the British Parliament, we see that there is a movement against the British Crown. Edmund Burke speaks in defense of the colonies. He says, slavery they, meaning the colonists, can have anywhere, but freedom they can only have from none but you. This becomes a big issue. It is up to Parliament to be able to deny or approve of colonial freedom. We'll talk a little bit more about that in part 3.